In this video, we're going to focus on solving quadratic equations by factoring. Now to start with, we're going to start with a pretty basic example of x plus 1 in parentheses and 2x minus 3. And notice that those two factors are connected with multiplication and equal 0. So the idea that comes from the zero product principle says if you have two factors connected with multiplication, that's what factors do, equaling 0, then one or both have to be 0. Otherwise, there's no other way you can multiply two numbers and get a result of 0 without one of them being 0. So this allows us to break this problem that has two factors into two simpler problems by setting each factor, x plus 1 equals 0 and 2x minus 3 equals 0, because we know that one of them's got to be 0 in order to make the product of the two be 0. Now, when you look at the original problem, you might not notice it's quadratic, but keep in mind we're starting with a simple example and we'll build. But if we were to multiply it out, note that the x times 2x would give us 2x squared, and there's our quadratic. Okay, so what we're going to do now is solve each of these. So these are pretty basic ones to solve. We'll solve the first one by moving the 1 to the other side and getting us x equals -1. On the other one, we'll first move the 3, giving us a result of 2x equals 3. And then we'll undo the 2 connected by multiplication by dividing both sides by 2. And we get x equals 3/2. And depending on what you're doing with those answers, you might want it as a mixed number, 1.5, or maybe even as a decimal, 1.5. So from this equation, we had two factors, and we saw it was quadratic. We have two solutions, -1 and 3/2. All right, let's look at an example now that has a little more to it. Okay, so for this one, we'll very clearly see our x squared of a quadratic. So x squared minus x minus 6 equals 0. So this one's not coming factored for us, but it does equal 0. So our job first then will be to factor the left-hand side of this equation, and then it'll look like the previous example. So in order to factor, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to our back number, -6, and add to our middle number. And we don't really see a number, we just see a sign, negative, so we know that's attached to the assumed 1. So we're looking for those numbers. So let's see, our factors of 6 are 1 and 6, 2 and 3. We know that we're multiplying to a negative, so if we subtract these numbers, we'll get a 5 and a 1. So it looks like it's the second pair, but now we have to think about signs, because when it multiplies to a negative, one's positive, one's negative, that's why we're subtracting. But now we need it to add to the -1, which again, the sign of the add number is the larger. So the larger of the two numbers, 3, is going to be our -1, and our 2 will be a positive. Double checking. Well, positive 2 times -3 is -6. That works. And positive 2 added to a -3 would get us a -1. That works. So we're ready to bring those numbers back in. Again, the front terms are x's, and put them inside the factors. So x plus 2 and x minus 3. And now we see a problem very similar to the one we just did, where we have two factors equal to 0. So again, that zero product principle allows us to break this up into two, what I call baby problems, two itty-bitties, and we can just solve them pretty simply. On the first one, we're going to move the 2 to the other side, getting -2. And on the second one, we'll move the -3 to the other side, getting +3. So our solutions are -2 and +3. Again, quadratic equation, we're dealing with squares, an exponent of 2, and notice we're getting two solutions. This happens most times. All right, let's try another one. Okay, so for this one, I'm going to do something a little different. Negative 16x squared plus 48x equals 0. And this is definitely quadratic because of the square, but it doesn't have three terms. It's not a trinomial on the left. We only have two. So the way we factor is going to be different. We're going to look for a greatest common factor on this one. And because the lead term is negative, we're going to take out negative. Note that 16 goes into 48 evenly, so 16's our greatest common factor of the numbers. And both terms have at least one x, so they have those in common. So we're going to take out that negative 16x, and I like to write it underneath when we do these kind of messy ones, just so we can keep straight what's left inside the parenthesis once we take it out. So in the first term inside the parentheses, we'll have negative divided by negative is positive. 16 divided by 16 is 1. X squared divided by x, 2x's on top divided by 1 on the bottom would leave 1x. Then for the next term, positive divided by negative, negative. 48 divided by 16, 3. The x's match exactly, divide out, and so we have no x's. Equals 0. Now for this problem, it's a little unusual because our first factor is a shorty. That is, we just have negative 16x equaling 0. So we'll talk about how to solve that in a second. And then the other one looks a little more common, x minus 3 equals 0. That's kind of like the ones we've been doing. So to get this shorty solved for x, we have to get rid of the negative 16. It's right next to the x, which means we divide. Connected with multiplication, we undo with division. So that will divide it out on the left and leave us just with x, but notice that 0 divided by any number other than 0 will give us 0. So those short factors, the single term factors, will give us an answer of 0. Whereas this second one will move the minus 3 to the other side with a plus 3 and get 3, giving us our typical two solutions, in this case 0 and 3. All right, let's go for one more that involves an extra step to start, and we'll see where that gets us. Okay, so on this one we have x squared plus x equals 30. Oh, we don't have a 0 anymore. So the first thing we have to do is get everything on the one side equal to 0. So in this case, we're going to have to move that 30 on the right side to the left. But notice it's not a like term with anybody. So it's going to kind of get tucked in the end. So we'll have our x squared plus x minus 30. And of course on the right side there's nothing left, but we put 0 as a placeholder. So everybody to the same side equals 0. Second step, we factor. And this is another one of those trinomials. So in this case we're looking for numbers that multiply to negative 30, the back number, and add to the middle one. And again, we have no number, but a positive, so a positive 1. So we'll make a list of our factors of 30, 1 and 30, 2 goes into 30 15 times, 3 goes into 30 10 times, 4 doesn't go into 30, 5 goes into it 6 times, and the next number would be 6, but we've already got that on our list. Okay, we're multiplying to a negative, which means we're subtracting. So 30 take away 1 is 29, 15 take away 2 is 12, or take away 2 is 13, 10 take away 3 is 7, and 6 take away 5 is 1. There it is at the bottom of the list. So now we need to figure out signs, because we're multiplying to a negative. That means one's positive, one's negative. Larger sign goes with the larger number. So the add is positive, so the larger number is positive. So our 6 is positive, our 5 is negative, and we're ready to come back and put those numbers in our factors. So x minus 5, x plus 6 equals 0. And again, it's a good idea to always check that by foiling it back out to make sure you did it right. And then we can now break this up using what we've just learned into two separate problems, x minus 5 equals 0 or x plus 6 equals 0. Solving the first one by moving the 5 to the other side by adding 5 gets us positive 5, and this one moving the plus 6 to the other side getting us negative 6. So our solutions, once again, two of them, 5 and negative 6. So we've now done several examples of solving quadratic equations by factoring.